unpack it for better understanding so that we know how to participate as citizens of this country called RSA. My guests are here. Without any further ado, please help me welcome them. Keith, as well as Elle, welcome to Dialogue Sessions on Capital Radio. You are with myself, the host, Toki Mohoto. How do you do today?
Good, thank you. Glad to be on board. Appreciate you reached out to us.
It's a pleasure. Hello, Elle.
Hi, good afternoon, Toki. I'm Elle-Sarah Rossato, and hello to you and your listeners this afternoon.
Thank you so much for making time out of your hectic schedule to help us unpack these critical matters. So often when we hear of tax-related matters, right, we only think of pay-as-you-earn. Well, myself particularly, I only know of VAT because I know it was increased not so long ago. We also know of pay-as-you-earn because they took a huge chunk from my salary recently. And also, we also know of corporate tax, based obviously on the different news that we hear about. But before we zoom into the different areas or topics we're going to be talking on, please help our audiences understand who exactly am I talking with today.
Okay, I'm Keith Engel. I'm the CEO of the South African Institute of Taxation. We have over 8,400 members of tax practitioners, including Elle-Sarah.
Thanks, Keith. Yeah, and I'm a proud member of your organization. I'm also a master tax practitioner with SARS, and I happen to also lead the tax controversy and dispute resolution division within PricewaterhouseCoopers in South Africa.
Thank you so much. Indeed, heavyweight guests that I'm going to be speaking with. And obviously, tax matters are no easy feat. So oftentimes, as I started, we hear of tax, but we really don't know what tax is. When it started, why is it important? What happens to us if we don't pay it? We've seen scary news lines of late where SARS is threatening, or even in America, the IRS goes as far as dipping into your account when you're not compliant. Maybe as a way of introduction, help us understand what is tax. Why must we be paying it or worrying about it?
Okay, well, why is tax? And let Elle-Sarah jump in on the second point about what they can do. I mean, the bottom line is government costs money. If you want government to build your roads, if you want them to provide social benefits, such as hospitals or police or education, it all costs money. Well, where do they get it from? They ultimately get it from you. Now, some people lose that connection. They want all those benefits and they think they're for free. They're not for free. They've got to come from somebody. Of course, you'd always prefer it to come from somebody else. But at the end of the day, tax is the price we pay for everything we're supposed to receive. Ellen?
Yeah, quite right, Keith. So you're right, Toki. It's not just the American Revenue Authority that can take money from your account. In South Africa, as Keith's rightly mentioned, everybody's got a due to pay a fair amount of tax, whether it's pay-as-you-earn, VAT, corporate income tax, provisional tax, whatever tax type it is. But what are the collection mechanisms SARS have? Unfortunately, they've also got the ability to dip into your bank account or to even take money from your salary. But they have the additional benefit of being able to take a judgment akin to what we know as a civil judgment. So for your listeners, I mean, that can literally blacklist you as easy as issue a statement and having it chubbed and signed by SARS officials and then by court. And then you have a judgment against you. And guess what? Next up, it gets referred to the sheriff of the High Court and they come along and they write up your stuff. So clearly that's not an area where one wants to play with SARS. You want to stay on the right side of the law.
Most definitely. Should we, though, be interacting with SARS only during tax filing season, or it should be almost our daily bread?
Well, Toki, I suppose it depends on what type of taxpayer you are. Let's take yourself. I mean, you'd be interacting with SARS maybe if you're a provisional taxpayer twice a year, maybe 3 times max when you submit your provisional tax return or your final annual return. It's a little bit different for corporate taxpayers, right? Because they've got an annual application of filing their corporate income tax return. Then they've got monthly pay-as-you-earn VAT. They've got provisional tax. They've got dividend withholding tax, perhaps. They've got interest withholding tax returns. And then they've got these ad hoc interventions where sometimes it's necessary for them to reach out and get guidance. And we call that directives. We call it advanced tax rulings. And you would have heard Edward Kieswetter talk a lot around the acronym VDP. What does that mean? So for your listeners, it means Voluntary Disclosure Program. And in simple terms, it is, if you've picked up a mistake somewhere in your return, come and tell SARS about it. Because if you don't, and they audit you and they pick it up, well, guess what? You're going to get an assessment and you're going to get penalties and interest.
Quite scary stuff. Keith, recently we heard the Minister of Finance, Mr. Tito Mboweni, right, give us his annual budget speech. And some were of the perception of view that it was pro-business and anti-poor. Obviously, we juxtaposing this against what South Africa and maybe the world over is going through in terms of what the effects of COVID-19 were. Do you share in the sentiment?
It's not on a tax side. So from a tax point of view, the minister basically called an end to tax increases. He said, basically, we can't afford it anymore. So what you saw is that when it came to individuals, he tried to give them some sort of inflation relief. He tried not to raise rates. On corporates, he was lowering rates slightly, but then corporates are going to lose some things like the incentives and losses. So it was kind of a trade-off for foreign investment. He really wasn't that pro-business on a tax side. He was trying to help as much as he could, because what he was trying to do was get growth. And if you're hostile to business and hostile to people like yourself, you're going to find yourself not having growth. The real issue for the nonprofits who were complaining was, if you look at the spending side, on the spending side, what you saw was cuts in social benefits. And you were hitting the mass. And so there was a decision made on the expenditure side that the easiest thing to do was to cut benefits across the board and to limit wage increases. I think there was a lot of anger that there wasn't more targeted cuts where the real fat was, where the SAAs and the ESCOMs and the state-owned enterprises and all of them, and where the tenderpreneurs were. And I think a more carefully selected budget would have eliminated that. But on the tax side, what you've been seeing over the last several years is the minister saying the same thing. We've taken as much money as we can from the people who are legally compliant. People like yourself who are paying tax should not be having to pay more. But what he did say was, we need to go after the people who are not paying what they're legally required to do. And that's where you see the commissioner and all of that putting a lot of effort. And that's when we talk about the criminal penalties and all of this, to say, if you haven't been paying the taxes and you know you're legally required, we're going to find you. And that really is going to come down to SARS. But that's where you're seeing a lot of money go.
Elle, let's zoom into the "we're gonna find you" that Keith alludes to now. We heard the minister stating, or rather the commissioner stating, that there's over 400 billion that they are now gunning for, right? Also remember, during COVID, we heard of the over 300 billion that was lost due to sin tax that couldn't be collected, right? How do you think this ambitious targeting is going to fare for SARS, or South Africa for that matter? How difficult is it?
So let's just be clear about the 400 billion, right? So the 400 billion is something that the commissioner has stated has been found in terms of assets, South African taxpayer housing assets abroad. So for your listeners, to keep it simple again, something called an automatic exchange of information that kicked into place in 2017. So what this means is revenue authorities are sharing information with one another regarding the tax affairs of their countries or assets being held in their countries. So what does it mean for SARS? It means that not only do they have sight of what your assets are locally, they now also have sight of what is happening abroad. And they can start doing a matching exercise. So what Mr. Kieswetter is saying is, we've got the information. We now have full sight. We're starting to get a 360 view of a taxpayer. We can look at what vehicles you drive. We can look at what properties you own. We can look at what suburb you live in. We can look at where you work. And we can even see what's being held abroad. Look, they've had the information since 2017. I don't know how updated it is, and I don't know how regularly they've been looking at it, but clearly they're mining information currently. So what are they doing? They're recapacitating SARS from a technology perspective. They're making it more digital, more AI. They're going to make it machine driven. so that by the time they call a high net worth, and hopefully not yourself, they'll say, we've got a clear view, Toki. We can see about your assets in Bermuda. So best you come and you tell us about it, because if we find you, again, we're going to tax you. And I spoke about those, the negative remedies that they can take in terms of tax collection. Is that somewhere you want to find yourself? And then on the 300 billion, I think, you know, they did pretty well, right? So by the end of March, we were thinking, shucks, these guys are going to be 300 billion behind. They actually did brilliant in the last couple of months. And they're ascribing a lot of that clearly to some injection and development in the mining sector and other industries that have been stimulated by COVID. Look at what's happened in the steel industry, the chemical and other byproducts industries. But also look at how clever they've been thinking around automated assessments. That's where they send you the SMS to say, we already kind of know what's happening in your life. Just press OK and we'll assess you. We'll assess it. We'll do our job or your job for us. So I think with that being said, they were something like 12% off target, much less than what we anticipated. A lot due to growth in the last couple of months, a lot due to technology input, and a lot due, I think, to them increasing compliance rates of taxpayers.
Let's look, Keith, at capacity. When Elle is mentioning the technology side, we know that we have an emergence of cryptocurrencies, blockchain facilities, and all these other nitty-gritties that are currently happening. How capacitated do you think or estimate SARS is in ensuring that they do recoup all the money that they want?
Okay, there are two questions. There's one, the cryptocurrencies, and the other, general capacity. I think the real issue that people talked about for a period of time is the hollowing out of capacity during the Magnani era. So that happened, and you'll see that both Mark Kingan, who was before, and now Kieswetter now, the two of them have worked very hard to recapacitate SARS. That has been very slow and steady. They are improving and coming back to where they were, but you can see that they're still very short, and they're short of two things. It's not just computer technology and all of the things that come with it, but they're also short of skilled staff. And that's going to take a long time to bring it. It's not just a matter of hiring. So they are committed to it. And we'll see over the course of the next several months how their hires go. I mean, it's not only good enough to hire people, but you've got to hire the right people. And that sometimes is a challenge. And then after you hire the right people, you've got to put them in the right place, and you've got to get them to be productive. And that is a hard, hard task. The other area where it comes to SARS technology is coming down and talking about some of the data that Elle-Sarah was talking about, where can we get data from third-party sources? Now, that's not just an issue of money, but one of the big challenges for government, and SARS especially, is being able to collect third-party data to find out about you. So you file a return. Well, the question is, do they have other information to see whether you're telling the truth or not? So it's important that they always get dual returns. So you'll see they get it out of the banks and the insurers, but you've got to get those returns and say, well, you received money from the bank, and if you didn't report the interest that you received, they go, well, the bank is saying you received interest. Why aren't you reporting this? That system has to be better built. It's there, but it could use improvement. More importantly, what you find is that we have an uncooperative government with the other agencies. The other agencies don't give SARS the necessary data on, data on where people are, status of residency and citizenship, the IDs. But more importantly, when government pays money to those tenderpreneurs, none of that information is shown to SARS. So SARS doesn't know whether these guys are getting rich or not unless they see their houses. So they've got to work very hard as a matter of law to get that kind of coordination. And that's going to be a several-year effort. But if they achieve that, and I think that's exactly what the commissioner wants to do, you will find a very effective revenue service. But it's easy to say, hard to do. I'll come back on that. I don't know if you want to add any more on that, Elle-Sarah, but that's the picture I see. I think she froze for a second.
Yeah. Agreed, Keith.
The question, though, that I would want to ask, when you look at the legalities, right, in regards to SARS capacity, or rather mandate to collect taxes from us, where do we draw the line between them practicing a bit of overreach, but also at the same time, we as responsible citizens in inverted commas, playing our part and being compliant. Are there laws, that you know of which perhaps the general public is not aware of, or even businesses who want to be compliant don't even know that there is a particular statute or law that I need to be au fait with for me to be a dutiful citizen?
So definitely, Turkey. I mean, the overarching tax acts, right, are the ones that we should be fairly familiar with. The Income Tax Act, the Value Added Tax Act, just to name those two that have been in our let's say cadre of tax laws forever. And the most recent one, the Tax Administration Act, that came in around about 2012. But those are underpinned. And for instance, the Tax Administration Act, right, that puts out the powers and the duties of SARS as well as taxpayers. So that's all confined and enacted in the Tax Administration Act. But what underpins that? So it's overarched by the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act, right? That says a state organ must act within the confines of the law and must be fair and reasonable. But it's also underpinned by the Constitution that ultimately governs the laws of the country. So taxpayers have got a host of rights, right? But it's all supposed to be balanced with fairness and reasonableness. So you have a duty to comply. You have a duty to give an accurate return to SARS in terms of what you earn and what you believe to be deducted for tax purposes. They have a duty to act fair and reasonable towards you, but also to ensure that you pay your fair dues. And that's why we call it the audits, where they do their checks and balances to make sure that you've actually properly declared. So I hope that gives your listeners a bit of an insight in terms of the Act. I would say predominantly nowadays in terms of procedure, how SARS treats taxpayers. The tax administration is pretty much the Bible in SARS's lives. And that you would see continuous developments. You would hear Mr. Kisweta this week around talking about criminal prosecutions, right? And the harshness of if you don't submit a return or you don't keep accurate records, we're going to come for you. And the questions were, but is that reasonable? Is that fair? Should the penalty not befit the crime? And he was saying, well, just remember, there's also the barrier of blameworthiness. So you should be a taxpayer that's, number one, transparent, and that is somebody that takes its tax affairs serious and honest. But then the state ultimately carries the burden of beyond reasonable doubt of finding you guilty. So there's some legwork to go to. The point is just what he was saying is this is pretty much the way the tax affairs are in any event dealt with across the globe, and they are just emulating it in South Africa as well. So for your listeners, one must be fair, one must be transparent, one must be clear, and one must be truthful. But one must also make sure that SARS don't, let's say, cross the line in terms of the powers and duties afforded to them in the Tax Administration Act.
Keith, I want to jump into excuse me, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to get into the point that there's two issues that are going on that are getting mixed, but they are connected. And that is, you want SARS to have the power to enforce against those people who really are outright illegal, the David Kings and all of that, the Zumas, all those people who are clearly, they need to be enforced. And what we see is a lack of capacity to go after the people that thumb their nose at the law. And when people are thumbing their nose at the law and they're simply just earning money and not paying what they should to SARS, they're not reporting or doing anything, you want the SARS to have the power to go in quickly enough and people don't wage a Stalingrad defense. On the other hand, and that's where what you hear being discussed, is that oftentimes you and me will get audited. Mm-hmm. And you need to have the benefit of proving yourself innocent and that being respected. And if you find that you're getting bulldozed, then the laws become overly harsh. And that's what a lot of people are genuinely scared, that sometimes the little guy is getting bulldozed, but the guy who's totally thumbing his nose at the law, somehow they don't care and they walk away free. And you'll see lots of back and forth noise going on about this. And I would expect it to get even more so as time goes ahead.
Mm-hmm. It becomes quite a controversial issue where you look at perhaps certain corporates, right? We know there's a report I read, I forgot where it was, but I was looking at the figures that was said to be harbored by corporate criminality where tax reporting is concerned, right? How endemic is this? And do we even have a measurement or a calculation of if the fees were to be recouped, how would one go about doing this? Number two, when you look at corporates that are of overseas origin but operate here, do the same tax regimes or collection apply also as you'd find in SA? If, for example, I'm listed in the London Stock Exchange but still operate here, how does one operate the two or manage the two?
Yeah, I mean, you can jump in, go ahead.
No, so I mean, those are difficult questions, right? So first of all, whether we necessarily seeing a lot of what you were saying in your first bit around of corporates trying to swindle the tax system, maybe in my seat that I hold warm currently, I don't. And when we do detect errors or issues where we don't agree, I mean, the first step is really to approach SARS and say, look, we need to correct the returns. On your second question around entities that are managed abroad and maybe have a PE, a permanent establishment, or a place of business in South Africa, remember it's separate tax laws, right? So it might be that they've got a presence in the UK and that those tax laws will apply, and that they've got a presence in South Africa and those tax laws will apply, and similarly so for Argentina or New Zealand or wherever they're sitting. The point is just that I think where you're hinting to is that the world is becoming smaller for taxpayers, meaning that revenue boundaries are being lowered. That means that revenue agencies are becoming more and more cooperative with one another in terms of not only sharing information, but to give you an idea, Australia and, for instance, the UK have not only got sharing of information agreements, but they have mutual assistance agreements, right? So what does that mean? It means that if SARS were to find, to assess a taxpayer in South Africa and were to find that that specific taxpayer, corporate or otherwise, has got assets abroad, well, guess what? They can actually reach out to the UK and say, we would like for you to institute collection actions in the UK, and for you to assist us in collecting the revenue in the UK. So the point is just, is it worthwhile in this day and age to start taking those type of tax risks? There's a big difference, of course, between evading tax and avoiding tax, avoiding being tax planning and being able to look at the tax acts and see where you can plan your affairs to obviously pay the least amount of tax fair and due to revenue, versus the evading part. And that's where Keith was hinting to. So that's the bit about closing in on the tax gap. So what does the tax gap mean? It means, are we having a proper sight around who must pay their fair dues versus who are? And that massive gap is where I think the commissioner and, for instance, the appointment of Judge Davis this week is hinting towards putting in more people, recapacitating the system, putting in new technologies for the organization to become more system driven, but also to put back the skill. So what is Judge Davis's role going to be? It's probably going to be to resuscitate what he did a couple of years ago in any event. He was the chair of the Davis Tax Committee that brought out a whole range of reports. Last one was filed in 2018. And what has happened with those reports? It's probably been shelved, right? And when Mr. Kieswetter joined in 2019, I would think that as a newly joining CEO who was at Revenue a couple of years prior, he pretty much had a script of issues that were already identified as things that had gone completely wrong in Australian SARS. So it's now literally picking up the report and saying, let's look at that, let's fix it. And I think one can see out of his actions in the last couple of months and even years that I think his heart's in the right place. I think strategically, the objective is to recapacitate, rebuild, make it efficient, make it effective, to act in terms of their mandate and bring in the correct revenue that's due to the fiscus, and to get it to a center of excellence to what it was during the Gordon era.
Just a point about the tax gap. because that's what people are talking about. And that is, I do think Davis has got his heart in the right place, and so does the commissioner. I think the real problem for them is nobody really knows what the tax gap is. You don't know what money is not being reported, because if you did, you would already be collecting it. So you're being asked to find what is supposedly out there. And unfortunately, a lot of numbers and a lot of blame has been thrown around. And basically, it's been political, where people are trying to find easy answers, or it's part of a larger political mandate. And so the question is, where is the real blame? Where is the shortage? And there may be some general places where that is, but people don't exactly know. That's what you need to hire the 200 auditors for, to find out, is to find out where is the real gap. Now, the gaps can occur in several places. Yes, is there money offshore that nobody is reporting? I guarantee you there is a good chunk of that. There's also a good chunk of it that is being reported. One of the difficulties for SARS is they tend to focus more on the people who are more visible to them than the people who are wholly invisible. But there is definitely there. Now, the question is at who? There are certain corporates that are more aggressive than others. Generally, though, if you're finding the people who are compliant, the compliant people, they might have an argument of an interpretation or a systems failure, but they generally try to comply. So you're finding there's certain battles that are going on where they're political, and people are being accused who are not really blameworthy. But where would the money be? Some of it would be offshore. Some of it would be even in small businesses. You'll find people keep 2 sets of books. That's a problem. You will find that tenderpreneur space where, look, if they cheat the government on the tender, what makes you think they're going to pay the tax? Then there, of course, the wholly illegal business or the cash business. So they come in different forms, but it's easy to estimate off of the back of a matchbox where it is. But the problem is people don't. And so the difficulty is you don't want people being wrongly accused in this atmosphere. You actually have to find out where the problem is. And that's really going to be the challenge for SARS. But there is definitely a gap. And to be fair to SARS, every fiscal system around the world, every tax system in the world, there is a tax gap. I mean, I've been in Canada, the United States, UK, they all have a tax gap. So I don't know if ours is any worse than anybody else's. It's some places it might be better, some may be worse, but there is a gap and it is not easy to close.
Elle, I remember at some point when SARS suffered reputational damage owing to the infamous, whether it was in existence or not, the rogue unit, right? I just want to ask a bit, do you sometimes feel that there may be a politicization of SARS and its functions, where perhaps it may be used as a punitive tool to go against certain factions, whether in the corporate space or even in the public arena?
Okay,
Yeah,
just from my
definitely.
point of view. Okay, go ahead, Alice. Sorry.
Go for it, Keith. Go for it.
Yeah, just from my point of view, I haven't seen SARS doing much political targeting. There has been a little bit, you could argue. I think the EFF might argue otherwise. But there's 1 or 2 that have been hit. I think the biggest complaint is they haven't gone after enough political people and enough high-profile people. And I think one of the arguments is, and I think that's what David said, was that if you hit a bunch of high-profile targets, you'll find that everybody else will come into line. But I mean, let me just say this with Zuma. I mean, to defend Ivan Pillay, my understanding, according to what I read, was that when Zuma didn't pay his taxes, he got a call from Ivan Pillay pleading to pay his taxes. Now, that shows me that they weren't enforcing. You don't plead the president to pay his taxes, you just enforce. And when you see that, I think that's where we are. But I don't think SARS has been used in that way. I mean, anyway, you can jump in, Alice. Sorry to interrupt.
No, agreed. And Toki, I can tell you, I was with Revenue for many, many years under the Gordon administration. And definitely, I don't see that as political targeting. I agree with Keith. I think they've got a massive task, political or otherwise, high net worths or otherwise. I mean, we can just read the Zonda or look at what's happening at the Zonda Commission and see what's falling out of the tree. And I mean, there's a whole host, that's a whole project on its own. One can look at, for instance, the scandals that's been arising out of the PPE and how there's been individuals that have clearly made a fortune out of that, and that should be closer investigated. So, I mean, so we can go down the line. We can look at the informal sector. We can look at certain industries that SARS has always said is high profile and high risk. They've made no qualms about that. The point is, the renewed focus is now on high net worths, right? Rightly or wrongly. And that's what Judge Dennis Davis has been saying this week, is to say, we're coming after you. We don't believe that you're properly declaring what you should be declaring. We're going to have a look at what's abroad. We're going to have a look at what's here, and we're going to reconcile that with what you've submitted to us, right? So clearly they'll have the benefit of having seen all of the information, third party, abroad, and otherwise, and then having a look at their system and saying, okay, so you've only declared X amount. That just doesn't tally up. And in SARS's terms, that's called a lifestyle audit. So we clearly know it's coming, right? They're putting in a lot of money into it. They're going to rebuild it. They're going to source people for it. But what they also need to do is on the enforcement space. And that's what Keith was saying. A quick fix is bringing in the technology, having the machine do everything. The more difficult one is finding the skill to actually do the work. And then Mr. Keith has said he's got 88,000 applications. Well, that's wonderful, but one needs to find that correct skill to go and recapacitate for the big drainage of, let's call it the brain drain, because it is what it is. There was a brain drain out of SARS. So how are we going to bring back those key people to bring in the renewed energy, focus, and dynamism that he needs to up their game? And there they've been lagging. Keith is right. There's tax gaps everywhere. But I think with revenue, maybe, and the Moyana era that took SARS back a couple of steps, taxpayers took advantage of that.
Yeah.
And they've probably been moving assets and starting businesses and not properly declaring and doing all sorts of things. Now it's the process of finding those individuals, or actually a call to action to say, guys, you better step forward because we're going to look for you.
Mm-hmm. I just want to zoom into a very much publicized, I'm not sure if it was overly publicized or they were trying to teach someone a lesson, the KPMG fallout. I remember when I lived in Joburg, I used to go past Jan Smart's Avenue and I would look at this massive KPMG building, and one would deduce a perception that perhaps tax practitioners may be encouraging a bit of tax fraud or evasion even. What was your estimation of that scandal and how did it dent the fraternity, as it were?
Well, let me say that the scandal at KPMG was not a tax scandal. It was what I call an advisory firm scandal. So what you've seen is that the tenderpreneurs have farmed up with the advisory in order to rape the government. So I would put, poor KPMG, I think, took an unfair hit, far worse than what they did. I mean, you saw that they took a harder hit than a whole bunch of other people like Magnani and all of them. But what you'll see in the tender space is they're often supported by advisory firms, which would be the Bains, McKinseys, all of them. You can see with the ESCOM, you saw they were there with SARS. That a lot of these, what they do is they legitimize a false tender. And what happened with the KPMG was Magnani was just trying to do something internally to shake up his enemies, and he just used the KPMG label. So that wasn't a tax violation. There was a little bit of tax where what you saw was on the Gupta returns, where you would argue that some of those positions about claiming deductions for the wedding was a little bit aggressive. Let's just, let's soften the words there. And the thing that you have to worry about is when tax preparers start to justify numbers that cannot be justified. So a better example is I'm looking at Trump's returns, where he was deducting all sorts of personal expenses for himself and his children. And you'll find that in a lot of mid-sized and small businesses where tax preparers will say, let me just claim it, and worst comes to worst, SARS will just deny it. And so that kind of aggressive return is a problem, but that wasn't the height of the KPMG scandal. It was really an advisory one. And I do think that KPMG suffered disproportionately next to everyone else.
Mm. Do you think the NGO sector or social entrepreneurship may fall victim to perhaps certain organizations who want to use the provision by SARS of exempting social entrepreneurs from reporting?
I think that's a very good issue. Now, that's in my world, so that's a little outside the PwC world. But when you're talking about the nonprofits, you're talking about the churches, talking about entities like ourselves. You could be talking about the charities, all of those. Now, there really isn't a lot of big tax violation, but for another issue, and that is when you get benefits, you get donations, you get people putting to the collection plate. What you find is governance problems around the executive, where the executives overpay themselves. And sometimes those executives don't report tax on some of the more illegitimate spaces. And there is a problem, which I would have to highlight to SARS, is that oftentimes if the executive have basically taken the funds for things for themselves as opposed to their charitable cause, that oftentimes they don't do the payroll tax, or they don't make their salary tax, or they take excessive amounts. And the problem is SARS only has the power to go after the charity, not the person. And that's created some distortions. And I know in the church area, there has been, some excessive salaries going on, but that's not just a violation of SARS, it's really a violation of the donations. But I do think it's a problem.
And finally, just keep, and an abuse of some of those entities' structures, right? So using the entity and then abusing it for other illicit means, just to add on to what you were saying. Yes. I think there's some risk as well. Yeah.
Any closing remarks from yourselves as we gracefully wrap our session?
So Toki, from our side, I think if I hear what SARS is saying, and if you look at the Vision 2024, as they call it, right? I think what they're trying to do is to provide clarity and certainty to taxpayers, right, around what your obligations are. They're trying to make it easier for us folk to comply. Ultimately, they've got a lot of objectives, but ultimately, what do they seek to do? To regain public trust and confidence in the tax system, because I think that's been greatly scarred. But what is my overall parting message? I think it's in everybody's interest that we have a fully functioning, fully operative, effective, efficient revenue. If we don't, we all suffer. It means that a small portion contributes to the bigger basket, and we got a lot of expenses. So it would make us essentially, would make us bankrupt, right? Which is not what we want. Like Keith said, what do we need as SA Inc? We need everybody to contribute to the basket so that we can pay for hospitals and schools and fixing the roads and social grants and. So it's in everybody's interest to contribute. How you then structure your affairs, well, that's a separate story. But what we're saying is, I think revenue is on the right path. I think they're making the right noises. I hope they find the requisite skill to recapacitate, but we need a fully functioning revenue.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I would agree with that. And let me just add, I think SARS's heart is right in the right place. I think we both feel that way. I think what they're trying to do is admirable and under very difficult circumstances. The real issue for them is, will they hire the right skills? If they hire the wrong skills, what starts to happen is you get misplaced aggression. So that's the first risk for them. The second problem really for SARS, and it's been going on for a long time, is the role of the rest of government. Yes, let's say SARS